recording before the noise starts. Right, it started. It has started. We are here. It is a first. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. This is Historical Tangents. My name is Mr. Mack-Poole or Samuel Mack-Poole. Okay, we're going by Christian names or first names if we're not going to say Christian anymore. But we're going by first names as well today. I'm the Director of Humanities at Bexley Heath Academy, and I'm, of course, a history teacher. And I've got my first ever guest, okay? And I'm honoured to be with...
Hey, I'm Alex Gash. I'm head of social sciences at Law Manor Academy. I'm also a history teacher as well.
Okay, all right. Joy, it feels a bit like University Challenge, doesn't it?
Well, the fact that we went to the same university.
Well, we could be on the same team, couldn't we? But would you want two historians? Anyway, right. Tangents. See, tangents everywhere. So what Mr. Gash or Alex and I are going to discuss today is Nikita Khrushchev. Is he the villain of the Cuban Missile Crisis? So that is like the overarching question. I think this discussion probably will spill out in little tangents, which is why it's called Historical Tangents. But Alex is my esteemed guest, and I'd like him to answer this question first.
Well, for me, the answer is yes. He's a villain. He's a villain. There's no heroic behavior. All of his behavior is nothing heroic about it. He is a villain. He's selfish. If you look at when he comes into, if you look at every action he takes in the Cold War, it's for his own political, personal development. I don't think there's anything within the Cold War that he's doing to improve relations between America and the Soviet Union. He's not doing anything to improve the Soviet Union's position. He's doing it to fulfill his own political, what he sees his own political destiny. If you look at, I mean, I'm going to go on my first tangent straight away. If you look at when he comes in and he promises de-Stalinization, he promises to sort of start reining in the changes of Stalin, and all of a sudden that causes massive problems in terms of Hungary and obviously further down the line with Czechoslovakia as well. So he promises one thing and then he doesn't do the other. You can see he's saying, you know, he's playing lip service to people. He's saying what people want to hear to try and fulfill his own political agenda. My argument would be that when it comes to Cuba, he's trying to just basically get himself out there as getting his name out there. He's trying to put his name on the map. He's trying to win the Cold War, but not necessarily for the USSR, for the Soviet Union, whatever you're calling it in this context. But he's trying to win it for his own political gains. If you look at Cuba, Cuba doesn't originally want to be communist. They just want the Americans out. There's no aim for them to be communist to start with. Khrushchev's role in this is just to sort of say, yeah, communism would be a nice little vehicle to be there. Again, you know, it's quite common knowledge that having, for using miles, kilometers, whatever, but having an ally 90 miles off the coast of Florida for the Soviets is obviously it's incredibly helpful for them. So yeah, my argument would be that in the Cuban Missile Crisis is as is a lot of his behaviour throughout the Cold War is to try and fulfil his own political agenda. And I think also a lot of the time he sort of finds himself trying to cover up his own mistakes. So he loses in Berlin. Obviously, you know, he builds the wall, but he doesn't really get his own way in Berlin with the Berlin Ultimatum. He withdraws it, he puts it in so many different times. So yeah, I think he loses his own way in Berlin. So I think he finds that the Cuba is an opportunity to sort of reaffirm himself and test Kennedy once more. When you look a bit further into the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, in the 13 days, you have those 2 days where he panics and he sends 2 different letters. It's because he doesn't really know what he wants. He's just faffing around. He's just chucking ideas out there. He's throwing the fishing line. He's just seeing what he can get out of there at the moment. No, that's not heroic behaviour. I mean, you might not argue he's not villainous. He's not exactly a super villain when he's doing it, but yeah, he's just chucking out there and seeing what he can get from Kennedy because he's messed up. He sends these boats up to the blockade, and he doesn't really know what's going on. He's like, well, I assume they'll probably let us through, and then we'll have a lovely ally on the doorstep. When we look at the end result of it, with the removal of the missiles from Turkey, it's all done in secret. He gets nothing out of it, and actually, he actually gets the opposite to what he's aiming to achieve in terms of political moving forward. He actually ends up shooting himself in the foot because obviously he falls from power, and that's one of the contributing factors. With most of the high-ranking Soviet officials feeling that he's given in too easy there, and I think that's why some people get this heroic image of him. The fact that he's a bit of a martyr. He loses his political position because he's willing to work with America. Yeah, okay, you end up with the SALT discussions, and you end up with the removal of missiles. And he succeeds in having Cuba being a communist ally on the border, across the coast to America, but ultimately, this portrayal of him being a martyr because he sacrifices his career to sort of save relations there. They were just a happy coincidence. If you look at this from sort of a Kantian perspective, you look at means and ends. He never set out to try and achieve an amazing agreement, like to get the SALT discussions going and to get missiles removed from Turkey. He wanted to put Kennedy in his place, and he wanted to sort of secure himself as the big man, and consequently the Soviet Union as well. But I would say the opposite of what he's aiming to do. He's trying to big his own position up, trying to big the Soviet Union's position up, and increase weapons at this time. And ultimately, actually ends up doing the reverse of these by the time he falls from power. That's my stance on it.
All right, so that's quite equivocal. That's quite You know what? It's quite funny because obviously we went to the same uni, and we think completely differently about history. So I've been teaching this like completely differently. I guess I'm naturally controversial, and maybe I take the other side. So I'm quite interested in looking at things from the Soviet Union's perspective. So, but clearly you've thought about it from some of his perspective because you think that he makes a miscalculation. Now my position is somewhat different. I think the main thing what Khrushchev wants is simple parity. I think that was an overriding Soviet Union obsession. Okay, there was an obsession in the Soviet Union of being on equal terms in terms of nuclear weapons, missiles, and just as a superpower. They felt that America were ahead and that they were playing catch up. America was the first country to have nuclear weapons, first country to develop their missiles. So the Soviet Union feels like they're playing catch up. However, within the context of this, there's an interesting little subplot and tangent, if I may be a contrarian, and that's in the space race, the Soviet Union is ahead. It is ahead. It's already ahead. So over this period from 1957, with Sputnik, and they get Yuri Gagarin on the moon, they land a ball on the moon. That was spoke about at Camp David. So in the summit meetings, when Khrushchev is the first ever leader of the Soviet Union, the first ever Soviet Union premier, and his family, and they go to America for discussions basically on Berlin. In that context, they've already put a ball on the moon, so they've got a missile to go around the moon. So there's been quite a lot of success, I think, scientifically, should we say, or just within that narrow space race strata of the Cold War. Now let's fixate: is he the villain of this? I'm going to say no. I'm going to throw my historical reputation out there like this, and hang my hat on this rung of history, and I'm going to explain why I think he isn't the bad guy. I always think in history you've got a degree of American exceptionalism. So whatever America does because they are the victorious power in the Cold War, we've got a victor's history, and therefore it's just like America good and Soviet Union bad. This is how I feel that the course kinds of runs. So it's okay for America to have missiles in Turkey and Italy. That's completely okay. But when Khrushchev wants to put missiles on Cuba, all of a sudden there's this international outrage, and he's not willing to have that. He's like, because it could put the Soviet Union in a position of having that glorious first strike. So in a position which the Soviet Union is already in, Kennedy's almost willing to go to war for. Okay, so I think maybe the strength of the American reaction surprised Khrushchev. Maybe Kennedy's aggressiveness, and he just put it right on the world stage as well. This is the thing about JFK. He didn't hang around, did he? And I think part of that motivation was what happened at the Vienna meeting. Okay. So in the Vienna meeting, Khrushchev put Kennedy on the back foot. And I personally feel that Kennedy came out of that meeting feeling pretty aggrieved because he had not expected the strength of Khrushchev's or passion or aggressiveness in that meeting. I think he was just put on the back foot and he came out feeling unhappy. Also, Kennedy looks a bit weak because of the Bad Pigs scenario. So I think he wants to have more of a strongman reputation in his political legacy. So I think there's a degree of that. So, but that basically is admitting, and I'm not saying that Khrushchev is perfect in this. I think Khrushchev miscalculates the response of the Americans. Okay, so it escalates. All right. Now, one thing that I think every historian has to admit is that Khrushchev he's a bit of a flip-flopper. Okay, so for me that doesn't make him evil. I think he's a man of passion. I think he sometimes gets angry and says things that are unwise. Okay, so I'm not saying this makes him a hero. All right, but there's a difference between being a bit foolish and being a villain. Okay, and I think they're two very different things. So Khrushchev does make a mistake in this. I will admit that, but I think it's a mistake for the wrong reasons. And when we talk about consequentialism, so I think you're talking about Kantian. I think you're talking about the consequences. So I think a lot of times in history, when you judge the consequences of a process, often the consequences can be very negative, and yet they're still attributed. So I think even if his consequences are unintended, I think they're sometimes the most important consequences to weigh up. So when we talk about those SALT meetings, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the consequences they're really positive, like for me. So you've got the hotline set up, so you've got more direct communication. You've got you've got a test ban treaty. You've got the outer space treaty. You've got, I forgot the name of the treaty, but non-proliferation treaty. That's it. Okay, now this for me, like, I don't know why that's not included within kind of like a more détente realm of thinking. Okay, because that's clearly there's a lot of communication that's going on there in this superpower relationship. Following that, you've got SALT 1, Helsinki Accords, ping pong diplomacy, which is obviously with China, that's slightly different. And then you've got SALT 2, which is never ratified. So I think the consequences after the Cuban Missile Crisis are overwhelmingly positive. And I think that can be tied to this escalation, which for me is the fault of both sides. So that's kind of where I get my ideas. So if there's anything you particularly disagree with, please go ahead, because I'm drying up right now, Mr. Gash.
No, that's fine. I forgot to bring a notepad, so I was just typing a couple of just while you were speaking. I was just typing my thoughts so I could get back to you a little bit there. One of the things I do agree with you that about Kennedy sort of taking this sort of moral high ground and feeling sort of very annoyed about them putting Cuban missiles when they had their things in Turkey. It reminds me of the cartoon where Kennedy's sitting there with the notes on pruning, and Khrushchev's got like a tiny little bush, and he's got this massive bush. Have you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah, I really like that cartoon. I think sort of that summarizes the situation quite well. The fact that I agree with you on that point that Kennedy sort of can't really complain about the missiles being in Cuba when he's got missiles in Turkey. I think the next thing I thought it was quite good that you spoke about the space race, because I didn't mean to mention that myself. But doesn't the space race show that they weren't aiming for parity? The fact that they were pushing beyond and pushing further, that makes me think maybe that they did want to have that little one-upmanship and the unwillingness to give up Berlin as well. Surely if it was about just keeping things on the level, it should have been like, yeah, okay, you've got the east, we've got the west, you've got the east, etc., etc. So we'll leave it like that. We'll cut it down the middle, and that's fine. But not accepting that the Americans could have that little one up of having Berlin as the sort of utopian capitalist paradise floating around in the sea of communism in East Germany. Also going to races with the arms race, isn't it only the reason why the parity existed between the Soviet Union and the Americans with the arms race was because the Soviet Union were always one step behind. They had to look at the technology, wait for it to develop, and then they had to kind of catch up, because they didn't necessarily have. I mean, obviously they had amazing technicians, but they didn't have. They were always one step behind because they were playing catch up. Final other things, I suppose, were we have to remember that the missiles didn't need to be in Cuba. The Soviet Union didn't need to put them there. This was their one-upmanship attempt, because obviously they could have chucked missiles at America anyway. Didn't need them. It was more of a sort of a propaganda, a kind of a statement by having them there, rather than they could have chucked missiles at America anyway. So it wasn't that. It was more of it again shows that sort of Khrushchev was playing for this sort of political power. It was more of a power game for him rather than necessarily an attempt to sort of it's quite a villainous behaviour in my opinion to try and sort of get that kind of level of one-upmanship. You mentioned Bay of Pigs, which is absolutely right. I think Bay of Pigs just provided an excuse. I think my stance on Khrushchev is he would have found a way, even without the Bay of Pigs, to have sent missiles to Cuba. And when we look at this, so you look at the consequences, which is amazing. Yeah, the consequences were very, very good. And if history had been different, the Taunt had worked out quite nicely. then everyone would talk. You know, there'd be even more we'd write about Kennedy and Khrushchev and how they ended the Cold War even earlier than when we get to sort of Reagan, Thatcher, etc., etc. But the brinkmanship almost brought the world to nuclear war. It was like you had to go up to the edge of reason to allow that to happen. Is that reasonable? Is that you know, that's like saying a supervillain in a Batman movie. You know, the Joker accidentally saved everybody's lives, but you know he did just basically try and destroy the whole of Gotham before he did it. So if you look at your definition of hero, I still think you're playing a bit fast and loose with it.
Okay, sorry. Can I respond to that brinkmanship thing?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
If we're talking about that, then isn't Kennedy worse because he doesn't blink? And sorry, to go back to your two statements, there is the problem with Khrushchev is he is a bit hot-headed, and he says like, you know, the comments, "We will bury you," you know, like you know that seriously scared Eisenhower, and I think Eisenhower and Khrushchev are quite interesting to compare because Eisenhower was general in World War II, and I think he comes out of it kind of scarred by the violence, whilst seemingly with Khrushchev's comments, "We will bury you," he comes out of World War II. You know, this was someone who had experienced Stalingrad and you know the Battle of Kiev. You know, so he had clearly had some real first-hand experience of what the Great Patriotic War. So. Like, I think they're quite interesting to compare because I think that Eisenhower actually extends quite a warm hand of how should I call it, negotiation. Okay, so he negotiates with good faith with Khrushchev when he invites him to Camp David. I think that's I think we kind of underestimate what an important first that was for US and USSR relations. But anyway, sorry, there was a tangent within a tangent there. Now, to go back to this brinkmanship. So if Khrushchev is bad for his brinkmanship, well, at least he blinks. At least he thinks about, you know, if he's so self-centered as you said he was, he seems to think about his people and he seems to think about the world, okay? Because he's the one that says, all right, just promise. He sends two, and the fact he sends two memos or telegrams, I think that's really interesting because he is clearly reacting, or he is thinking a bit emotionally, and the reason he's thinking emotionally is because the stakes are so high. We're talking about a world nuclear holocaust here, so I think you can forgive him for maybe having a degree of anxiety. But he's the one that comes to Kennedy and said, "Well, actually, we do know there was a secret meeting, don't we, between RFK and Anatoly Dobrynin? So I think this was semi-discussed in the back rooms of power in Washington. But anyway." At least he does blink first. At least he does think about the population first. So I don't see him to be self-centered that way. And with regard to détente would have continued, right, had it not been for the oft-cited Soviet Afghanistan invasion, which of course was an intervention. I'm sure you agree. And Reagan was so aggressive in the Cold War. It was completely aggressive. Like he continued to have he had a brand new policy, wasn't it? And his brand new policy was containment was not enough. They were going to roll the Soviet Union back. Now, with regard to the arms race, there's a very, very interesting YouTube video, and I'm going to share it with you. And it shows you American military spending and USSR military spending and the number of nuclear warheads and missiles. And it wasn't until 1968 under Brezhnev that the USSR got parity. Yeah, they did not get parity until that time. So the Soviet Union was lagging behind the USA in terms of military spending, nuclear missile warheads. Okay, in terms of those two statistical areas, they were far behind. So it is strange that they were ahead in the space race, but you know, history is stranger than fiction. So writing down one of your things, I'm willing to give up Berlin. I mean, you know, it was. I find it. This is one thing I find curious, and I always say to my students, I think at that Yalta conference, essentially, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a dying man, and Stalin liked him, and I think there was good feeling in that Yalta conference because it was just before the end of World War II, and so I think maybe one too many vodkas and Nostrovya's down the line when they were having that negotiation, I think they've decided, yes, we'll divide Berlin as well. I think it's a huge mistake on the part of the USSR to do that, because it just creates this whole theme of tension. And really, the fact that they extended it, they allowed Berlin to be carved up anyway. When let's be honest, the Soviet Union did 90% of the fighting. They got to Berlin first. They didn't have to give up a square inch of that. Okay, so I think there is a good degree of faith on Stalin's part there, something which a lot of people wouldn't usually say. All right, I'm willing to give up the Berlin. Yes, one step behind, military spending, missiles, Bay of Pigs. Right, that Bay of Pigs, right. I don't think it's taught enough in history as a villainous act. It is a villainous act on a sovereign nation, right? If we are today going to hold Russia to account about what's going on in Ukraine, just to bring something really topically, yeah, we have to look at American history and look at the blood that's on their hands. They sent 1,500 Batista fascists to their island, and then bottled out at the last minute and didn't give them any air support. If that had been successful, it's a very, very aggressive act on behalf of the USA. They had no right to do that. And I think, again, because it's winner's history, if you watch any films on the matter, it's always about this heroic failure. Like who's making these films? Obviously, pro-American Hollywood, like the propaganda piece of the West. So I feel there's a lot of double standards and unfairness in any debate when it comes to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union are always the bad guys. Khrushchev or Stalin, like they're always the bad guys compared to the American. It's this American exceptionalism which I referred to earlier. The Americans are always seen as the good guys. If you ask the layman on the street who won World War II and why, probably most of them would say, "Oh, it was because of America." Yeah. If you went on the street and said, "Well, who's the first man on the moon?" Probably, sorry, not the first man in space. If you said, "Who's the first man in space?" they'd probably say, "Oh, well, it was Neil Armstrong." Okay. A lot of people just don't have any idea about the role of the Soviet Union in World War II or any of its, like, shall we say, humanitarian successes. Is getting a man into space a humanitarian success? Well, a human success. So I think there's a lot that needs addressing. But I think I'm broadening this out. Anyway, sorry. I'll now allow you to respond, sir. Please do.
I think I'm going to go reverse order to what you just. So I think the reason why the Soviet Union probably get portrayed as the bad guys a lot of the time is because a lot of their behaviour is bad. The lack of civil rights. I appreciate you've got the civil rights issues in America at this time, which is where you can argue about American hypocrisy, sort of trying to get the world to have more civil rights in the Soviet bloc, whilst they deny civil rights to their own people in America. But obviously, the Soviet Union, everyone remembers sort of the secret police. They think about the spying. They think about look at the Hungarian Uprising. You look at the Prague Spring and the responses of the Soviet Union there. I think that's where people kind of see the bad side of the Soviet Union. And up to the Bay of Pigs, you can understand that the people who'd lost their land would be upset. Even if the American government hadn't encouraged them to do so, there might have been the oddball who'd gone and tried to claim their land back as well. Appreciate probably wouldn't have been as on the scale of what America attempted, but I think you can understand why some of those ex can't remember the word now.
Landowners,
there we go. Yeah, that's not the word I was looking for, but yeah, it's fine. Yeah, the ex-landowners.
Aristocratic landowning class, Junkers, I don't know. Yeah.
You can understand why those exiles, there we go. You can understand why those exiles wanted their land back and, were willing to give the Bay of Pigs invasion a bit of a go. Whether that's enough reason to justify them going in, that's another thing. Going back to the relations between, I agree with what you're saying that Stalin and if you look at sort of history, what could have been, imagine if Stalin and Roosevelt had a bit of a run and maybe just allowed to be the big two, because I think even at Tehran, I think you see sort of you see Churchill getting left behind a little bit. And it is very much the Stalin and the Roosevelt show. So it'd be interesting to see, just from a a what if perspective, what would happen if Roosevelt and Stalin had been given a go as the main powers making all the decisions. Would we be talking about we'll be talking about this differently. You said about Afghanistan as well. Talk about SALT 2 and Afghanistan. SALT 2 was going to fall apart anyway. Afghanistan was just an excuse by that point. You've alluded to it already. The Americans under people like Reagan were sort of moving away from detente ideas. So Afghanistan was just an excuse. So I think SALT 2 would have definitely would have done anything meaningful, even if Afghanistan hadn't have happened. And just the final one, I feel like I'm sort of rushing through these last ones now. If the Soviet Union was lagging behind, Britain was lagging behind as well. They didn't try and get involved too much. They just sort of dropped out. Khrushchev was going to be the real good guy and be a real hero. Should have just dropped out. Just, if there's no one to compete against, there's no need to keep building nuclear weapons. So if the Soviet Union was always lagging behind so much of their nuclear weapons, why proceed with it? Just call it a day.
Okay. All right. So the behavior of the USSR is bad. I don't know. Like, so I've got a colleague at work, and he's very, shall we say, sympathetic to the USSR, and his quote's not mine. He kind of feels that the course that we study is just it's more of a focus on what the USSR did that was bad, rather than anything good, and also ignoring the parts, and especially the Asian peninsula, of what was bad. So you've got like Korea and the Vietnam War. I mean, when I look at this geographically, I think it's just thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from America, and yet it's just like meddling in other sovereign nations' affairs and this policy of containment. And sorry, you did allude a bit to if Roosevelt had a run. Of course he didn't, and Truman came in. Now, I find Truman an absolutely fascinating character, actually. And he's got a YouTube channel. Did you know this? He's got a YouTube channel, and he talks about all these events in quite a bit of detail. So it's absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely excellent resource. So any history teachers out there, and you're teaching Cold War, you can see him talking about Stalin. You can see him reading from his diary, which he had recorded, okay, and elaborating on his thoughts. So he's got this massive YouTube channel, which is called the Harry S. Truman YouTube channel. And I think it's such a great primary piece of evidence. Maybe it's a bit memoirish because he's looking back, but at least he's reading from his diary sometimes and looking into those events. So that's something I'd definitely take a look into. Now, sorry, I'm just going to get some water just because I'm a bit parched. But yeah, you did mention Hungary. You've mentioned it a few times. And see, what I find fascinating about the whole Hungarian uprising is that, well, the West did nothing to help. Now, why did the West do nothing to help? So this is for our higher level historians here. Well, Britain invaded Egypt. This is something which is never discussed. Never discussed. So at the self-same time, 1956, Britain is trying to take the Suez Canal, orchestrating a fake war between Israel and Egypt, okay? Invading it with its old imperialist talons to control the Suez Canal. It's absolutely outrageous behavior. Khrushchev, right, looked out for the Egyptians who were being victims of imperialist aggression and said he was going to fire rockets on the British if they didn't get out. Well, of course, Eisenhower panicked, didn't he? So he told the British, if you don't get out, I'm going to ruin your economy, because he didn't want to go to World War III. So anyway, going back to the USSR there, and I know that maybe it's not quite a Cold War issue, but still there are the Cold War, the superpowers are involved, because they both say to the British and the French and the Israelis, you have to get out, or else, and this is the one time in history that the USSR and the USA are bang on the same side, okay, over a major international incident. Okay, so it's quite a weird collaboration of powers. Odd bedfellows indeed. So I think that should maybe have at least a little paragraph in the textbook there. So essentially what I'm saying is it's very hard for America to condemn the USSR without condemning Britain, because they're both seemingly doing similar-ish things, which is bullying smaller powers, okay? But at least when the USSR is doing it, it's on their doorstep, and they've got reasons, and the reasons are Hungary invaded the Soviet Union twice. You've got to remember, it's only 1956, 11 years after the Great Patriotic War, from the Soviets' perspective, where they did 90% of the fighting and get only 10% of the memories of it. But in the West, it's never discussed. It's never congratulated that they broke the back of Nazism. So anyway, this country, Hungary, was a fascist country. They were part of Hitler's fascist club. the Hungarians themselves had invaded the Soviet Union. And what do you think? Do you think they respected human rights of the citizens of those of the Soviet Union when they got there? They probably did not. So I think there's a lot of enmity there between those two nations. Now, it doesn't justify what the Soviet Union did, but it does contextualize it for me. And when you're discussing, land had been lost and people have been upset about it. Well, if you took Buckingham Palace away from Queen Elizabeth II, I'm sure she would be upset too. But I'll tell you what, if you gave all the homeless people in London a bedroom to sleep in, I'm sure in the future people might understand. So like the problem with land is that it's a finite resource, right? And it's always the elites which get their hands on it. And through owning that land, they become immensely wealthy. And that's how we get a very unfair system in a capitalist model. So the only way to really deal with that is to reallocate it. And that's exactly what Fidel Castro did. Right, Stalin and Roosevelt meetings, Truman, USA did nothing. I think we've gone on a massive tangent away from Khrushchev. I think we've gone on a massive tangent. So is there anything else I want to say about Khrushchev? I'm going to come back to one last thing. Okay, he did operate on good faith. Okay, and his good faith was betrayed by America. So he went to Camp David with Eisenhower, and then lo and behold, who was spying up him from the skies? Gary Powers. How very dare he? Khrushchev was very, very upset because, of course, the Soviet Union had never spied on the Americans, not once. So it is a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? I think the reason that Khrushchev is so upset about it is because Eisenhower denies it. He won't admit. He does not admit to what happened. He doesn't say, okay, fair dinkums, we got caught. At first, he tries to deny it. And remember, these two men, they spent a lot of time with each other. They're broken bread. Like Khrushchev's stay in America is absolutely fascinating. So I think Khrushchev's reaction of storming out of the Paris summit meetings, there's a little bit of genuine emotion in that because he is an emotional character. But being an emotional character and although being angry, he's also a caring person. Remember, so you criticized him for de-Stalinizing, but that was a good thing, right? Like de-Stalinizing the USSR was a good thing. He allowed a bit more of a free press. Okay, it was still the Soviet Union, so you probably people didn't disappear under Khrushchev like they did under Stalin, but they were harassed. All right, but still, at least there was a movement, a gravitation towards a greater degree of freedom, which that sets in stone what happens under Gorbachev with Glasnost. I think that Gorbachev can genuinely look back and go, actually, no, there's a previous leader that's done something similar to this before. So there you go. I'll tell you what, I'm going to allow you the final response because I think we've gone back and forth. So those are my concluding comments on the whole Khrushchev and wider historical tangents. You please finish, Mr. Gash.
Yeah, that's probably for the best. I was going to say he was getting a bit indulgent rather than really helpful for the people at this point. So I'll try and sort of address as much as you can. I do agree that the Soviet Union, you can't say it's completely horrible. If you look at some of the nations once the Soviet Union fell apart, you can see how almost they're nations in disrepair, aren't they? They're countries which have basically the involvement of USSR, Soviet Union, that actually was because of the communist model, it actually kept them functioning. And then when that fell apart and they were given independence, it was almost like decolonization from Britain. There were nations that weren't ready for it. There were states that weren't ready for it. So it kind of caused massive problems within those nations. So you can see that it wasn't completely useless for all nations involved in it. I also do have sympathy towards the buffer zones. I completely understand that through these states, the Soviet Union had been invaded multiple times over the last, at least twice over the last. I mean, you go back to Napoleonic Wars if you want. So some of these nations have come through there as well. So they've been invaded multiple times. So you can see. I think what's interesting is you hear the names: buffer zones, satellite states, sphere of influence, and I think the fact that you've got those three different names for it shows the kind of sketchy interpretation of what was their purpose of them being there. Were they to be friendly governments? Were they to be basically puppet governments? Were they be there to be literally completely independent nations, which were a buffer zone? So the fact that those three names exist show that there was this kind of different interpretation about what they meant to everybody at this time. Just go back to the human rights issue. The Soviet Union obviously were quite happy to use their veto in the United Nations when it suited them, but obviously they weren't quite happy to follow necessarily all of the human rights situations which they were presented with. For example, talk about lack of freedom of speech, etc., etc. Would a hero show true patience in the U2 crisis? Would a hero have shown patience in there and maybe just be like, well, you know what, we do the same, so yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it. A true hero would forgive. What would Jesus do? Gandhi do? And I think that's quite an interesting point what you made about Glasnost. It's almost like Khrushchev's destalinisation was like the guinea pig that failed. But like I said, I think I think he was playing lip. Like I said, these words I used before. He was playing lip service. I think he spent hours, I think, from what I can recall, tearing Stalin a new one, basically, and saying about how useless he was and how bad the regime was. And he kind of, he sort of loosens the screws a little bit, but there's still the iron grip, as it were. The Iron Curtain is still very much hovering over Europe. So I think if he wanted to do what he said he was going to do, I think we would have seen Glasnost a bit earlier. That's
Okay.
me, Tom.
All right, Glasnost would have come sooner if he was genuine. All right, it's not a bad way to conclude. All right, I want to thank you for your time. I think
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. No. Thank you for having you. Right. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to put this on YouTube. I'm going to put it in the Edexcel teachers group, and I hope that we can get some other people speaking. I've got one or two people that have already said they'd like to do this. So if anyone would like to do this, you can get in contact with me. Of course, I don't have to be in control of this. If Alex would like to host someone, he sure can. But yeah, I just think it's just an interesting thing to do for history teachers and in particular students who may want to get a greater insight and some more knowledge or arguments around specific topics in the Soviet Union. And on that note, I'm going to stop recording. So can I stop recording? Let's see. Stop recording. Bada bing, bada bang, bada bing. Stop recording. All right.